Hi, so I'm Sawyer. We're team 7, and my group is Yaritza and Yuiri. So Stuart Hall had an essay that talked about how messages are distributed in terms of television. He spoke of communication and the four-stage theory of production, circulation, use or distribution, and reproduction. Each stage is very much separate and has multiple meanings for a word or phrase. Messages are received in particular stages, and sometimes the meaning or point of the message is recognized, and sometimes it isn't. For example, if someone said, I like your shoes, but the person receiving the message heard, like, you lose, and, got offended or was like, what is this guy's problem? It's similar to that. Hall has a way of looking at communication that is relatively unorthodox. He looks at things in more of a flow in the stages of his theory, like sender, message, receiver. Traditionally it's looked at in like a circular way in terms of how things are interpreted. Language at the phase of production or circulation is when the product, so to speak, takes place. This is followed by the circulation stage where the product is put into place. After this, the means of how the product is released in regards to social aspects is at play. The organization and combination of practices within media and its different forms are how the use stage works. The encoding and decoding occur in relation to the communication process as a whole. A historical event that is transmitted, for example, a newscast, can't become a communicative event until it has been a story. The message form must occur first. This is necessary because it's a form of appearance from the source to the receiver, and it's not just a random moment. There's significance. Things like broadcasting with a network of production and technical infrastructure are required to produce a program, and it's framed throughout the meanings and ideas represented, the knowledge and use. Television draws topics from agendas like events, personal things, images of the audience, definitions of the situation at hand from other sources, and uses that as their content. This is interesting because the audience is both the source and the receiver of the message. In Mark's terms, circulation and reception are moments of the productive process in television and are reincorporated into the productive process itself. Production and reception of the television message are not identical but related. They are different moments within the whole of the social relations of the communication process as a whole. Before a message can have effect, satisfy a need, or be put to use, it must first be appropriated and meaningfully decoded. The decoded meaning is what has an effect or influence, and it employs a code and yields a message, displays a message. The codes, uh, the codes of encoding and decoding may not be perfectly symmetrical, as you can see in the diagram that is shown by Yaritza, but it all depends on the degrees of symmetry and the degrees of understanding and misunderstanding in the communicative exchange. Now is Yaritza to talk a little bit more.
Hello, my name is Yaritza, and I'm going to be talking about Stuart Hall's encoding and decoding diagram. This diagram here of encoding and decoding is on page 510 of this chapter. This diagram shows the process according to Stuart Hall. The process of communication is the process of meaning and messages being organized through codes. In the process, there are two moments where the underlying meaning is determined. These moments are encoding and decoding. This diagram, as mentioned by Hall, is not exactly symmetrical. Hall mentioned in this chapter that understanding and misunderstanding depend on the degrees of symmetry and asymmetry. Here are two moments where the underlying meaning is determined. These moments are encoding and decoding. This diagram, as mentioned by him, is not exactly symmetrical. Hall mentioned that understanding and misunderstanding depend on the degrees of symmetry and asymmetry. On the encoding side, on the left here, the creators and advertisers are having to create a message for the audience. This message can be affected by the technical infrastructure. This is more like where they record or like their sets or where they shoot a scene for an episode. Wherever they shoot a scene for an episode can affect the message that is being given to the audience. Let's just say like if they're going to record a wedding at a church, they need to find that church and make sure it's to what they want the message to be seen as. And on the decoding side on the right, they can see other, like the audience can see other programs and compare them to other shows. And they can also discuss opinions with friends and see what they all interpret off of the message. And they can also look up reviews online, and that can affect the message and how they're taking the message that is being given to them. And the next slide, please. So this is the same diagram that I showed you guys previously, but here I'm going to explain the difference in this diagram. The difference in this diagram that doesn't make it exactly symmetrical is that on the side of encoding, we need to think about who is the encoder. Examples of encoder that I can think of is, for example, a content creator. And when I think of this, I think of YouTubers and broadcasters. Basically, it is who is giving the message out to the audience. And on the right side, we need to think about who is the decoder. And this is a person who is receiving the message. So the audience, the reader, whoever's viewing whatever the message is being given out to. And there's several examples of this, of decoders and encoders. Next slide. Now I will talk about denotation and connotation. A message that is being communicated can always be interpreted in different ways or could have a lot of different meanings. In this chapter, Stuart Hall believes that in communication, there is a denotation and connotation. Hall argues that the difference between denotation and connotation is not real. It just helps us analyze communication. He believes not everything has a literal meaning to it. He argues that there is always an associative meaning or connotation. This means that he believes connotations can have multiple meanings and not just exactly one. And here's just another picture of Stuart Hall. And now my next group member will talk. Thank you.
Stuart Hall came up with 3 hypothetical analyses of some possible decoding position of the encoder or the audience. These hypothetical analyses were from televisual code, but could be applied to any media. The first one is the dominant hegemonic position. The second one is the negotiated position. And the last one is the oppositional position. I will introduce one by one. So the first one is the dominant hegemonic position. For this, the audience fully accept the message and reproduce the message as intended by the encoder. Hall referred to these as an example of perfectly transparent communication. An example of a dominant hegemonic position is when the audience watches a dominant European or American news coverage of 9/11 and draws the common sense conclusion that the event is nothing more than a terrorist attack. As you heard, the audience is taking exact same message as intended by the encoder. And the second one is negotiated position. This is the middle between the dominant hegemonic position and the oppositional position. The audience broadly accepts the message, but sometimes opposes and modifies the message to their own. Hall did mention that there are exceptions and general rules in local and personal conditions. He gave the example of a worker's response to report of a pay freeze. The worker may agree such a freeze is the national interest and therefore adopt the dominant hegemonic position. However, this may have little bearing on her decision to strike at the shop floor or union level. Continuing from the example of 9/11 mentioned last slide, this would be the British Muslims audience who respond to the news of 9/11 by condemning the terrorist attack on America while protesting against the construction of Islam as uncivilized and subsequent racial abuse directed at Western Muslims. Clearly, the audience has both adaptive and oppositional ideas on this. And the last one is the oppositional position. In this, the audience understands the message but decodes the message in a contrary way and completely rejects the message. We can say that this is the complete opposite of dominant hegemonic position. This would give an alternative frame of reference. Continuing his example from above, he imagined the audience who hears the report of a wage freeze but decodes every reference to national interest as class interest. Alternatively, in terms of the 9/11 example, there was a news reported in the past that suggested the British Muslims believes the so-called war against terrorism led by Bush administration is a war against Islam. This is the actual instance of the oppositional position. You may already have noticed from some examples, but the reason why people choose dominant hegemonic position or negotiated position or the oppositional position is very different. That many factors like age, beliefs, culture, gender, personal background, ethnicity, and so on could affect the audience's response to these three positions. And this is the end of our presentation, and we came up with 5 questions and thoughts to ask. First one is, who can think of that is a decoder? Second one is, who can think of that is a encoder? And third one is, can you think of an example of the televisual code that could be interpreted differently? Fourth one is, do you agree with Stuart Hall's thoughts about encoding and decoding? Fifth one is, have you ever heard about decoding and encoding? Thank you for listening to our presentation.